We're very excited to be joined by Dr. Marc Lamont Hill and Yasser Qous. Thank you both so much for joining us. And to give a quick background on who our speakers are, Dr. Marc Lamont Hill is the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solution at Temple University. He's also the host of BET News and the Coffee and Books podcast. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, From Ferguson to Flint and Beyond, Gentrifier, and the forthcoming book, Except For Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. Dr. Hill is also the director of the upcoming film, Black in the Holy Land. His research focuses on the intersections between culture, politics, and education in the United States and the Middle East. And Yasser Qous is a master's student in the Department of History and Civilization at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. His research focuses on social history in Palestine, specifically focusing on the historical construction of the Black Palestinian community in Jerusalem, where he's from. And I'm Pascal Payan. I work as a research associate at McCann, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, where I'm studying cultural studies related to the African diaspora. I'll be facilitating today's talk. Behind the scenes, we also have my colleagues Hussein Khalidi and Sarona Bedouan. You won't be able to see them, but they'll be the ones writing to you in the chat bar and making sure everything runs smoothly. So before we start the conversation with our speakers, I'm going to give a brief background on today's topic. As most people know, George Floyd was brutally murdered by the police in broad daylight in Minneapolis, Minnesota on May 25th of this year. Much of the world watched the recording of the killing as George, with his murderer's knee pressed on his neck, suffocated for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George was 46 years old and he was Black. This is just one recent example of the reoccurring dehumanization and killings that Black people experience in the US at the hands of the police and the criminal justice system. George Floyd's death sparked the largest mass movement in US history, with people protesting from coast to coast and even across the globe, including in the UK. According to the New York Times, over 20 million people in the United States have participated in these demonstrations. These demonstrations have been led by Black Lives Matter, a movement whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by both the state and vigilantes in order to create a world where all Black lives matter. Black Lives Matter and the broader movement for Black lives have both repeatedly expressed support for Palestinian liberation. They've spoken out against the killing, oppression, and dehumanization of Palestinians by the Israeli state and have explicitly voiced their solidarity with Palestinians as part of their 2016 platform. This support is part of a larger solidarity between the Black American and Palestinian struggles for freedom. This has often come from recognizing the parallels between the Black American and Palestinian experiences of oppression. Both struggles have consistently called for dignity, justice, and equality in the context of oppressive, settler colonial, and institutionally racist states. Over the years, prominent Black activists such as Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, and Muhammad Ali have all voiced their support for Palestinian liberation against Israeli settler colonialism, oppression, and occupation. Many Black activist groups such as the Black Panthers, the Dream Defenders, and the Black Youth Project 100 have done the same. While it's obviously important to honor and continue the legacy of Black and Palestinian solidarity, this legacy also calls us to align with Black Lives Matter's mission to end anti-Black racism in all communities around the world. This means that we must also address anti-Blackness within communities of color, including within Palestinian communities. Black Palestinians face discrimination from both within Palestinian society and in relation to the Israeli state as colonial subjects. As Palestinians across the globe were quick to show their support for the Black Lives Matter movement, in a series of videos that went viral, Mariam Abu Khalid, a Black Palestinian actor, pointed to the double standards of this solidarity by highlighting the anti-Black racism she has experienced from her own society. In the videos, she details some of the frequent racist microaggressions and prejudices that unfortunately contribute to her experience as a Black Palestinian. We hope that today's talk helps shine a light on the experiences of Black Palestinian communities and the specific issues they face. Whether the enforcer of anti-Black oppression is the Israeli state or Palestinian society, as human rights advocates, we must understand that we must advocate for justice and equality for all Palestinians, including Black Palestinians who are often erased from the narrative of Palestinian liberation. So With this background covered, I'd like to start the discussion with Marc and Yasser. So my first question for you two is just to go over, who are the Black Palestinian communities of historic Palestine? What are their origins of these communities? Where do they live and why in these particular areas? Just to kind of give us a background. If we could start with Yasser for this question and then we can move on to Marc. Yasser, you're muted. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. That's fine.
Sorry. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation. I would like to thank Marc for joining this panel. Also, in order to talk about the Africans that they are, or the Black Africans that they are living in Palestine. But in order to understand the situation of the Black Africans, we have to think a little bit about the history of the Africans, of the Black that they are living in Palestine. So during to the older resources, the rare resources about the Africans or the history of the Africans in Palestine, we can identify that the Africans that they have been categorized on base of their origins or on the legal on the acts of and the legal aspects. So for the Ottomans, and I'm starting with the Ottomans because this is, I think, the long period that most of the African, the Black, have been deported to Palestine. For them, they have been dividing Africa into three regions according to the Islamic law. So we have regions that it's called Bilad al-Harb, which means the region of war, that most of the slaves, they have been deported from these regions, which means, and we can find in the resources, that there are particularly two regions, which is Ethiopia and Sawahili, which is Africa, the East Africa and the East Africa, especially in the East Africa. And another region which is called Bilad Salam, the region of Salam, of peace, which had been the state, or the Christian state in Ethiopia. So these people that they have been from these areas, they can consider as Zimmis. Zimmi in Arabic, it means that they are the population of the books that they are Christians or Jewish or something like this. The other region which have been named in the register or in the sources, in the historical sources, that they are being coming or arriving from Bilad al-Islam in Africa, which means the region of Sennar and Darfur. And according to these categorization of the land, the status or the social status, it had been created for the three groups that we are talking about. So the people that they came from the non-Muslim, what we can consider it the non-Muslim or the Bilad al-Harb, the land or the regions of war, they consider as slaves. So we have slaves that they are coming, that they have been deported from these areas, and the people that they came from the Bilad al-Salam, which is the region of peace, they are considered as Zimmis. They are free, but under condition. And we have the third group that they are coming from the Muslim region, that they name them that they are Tekruris. They are coming from the Tekruri area, which means Sennar and Darfur. So the status had been according to that, between a free man and a free man with limitation and a slave. And according to this category, we still find the continuity of this category till now in Palestine. So we have people that they are considered as slaves, and in Arabic, and what they call it abid. And we have the other people that they consider themselves that they are the part of the the ummah, the what we call it, the nation of Islam or something like this, which are they considered that they are terrorists. So this, as I say, this give us a little bit about the history of the of black that they are living in Palestine, and till I think the end of the Ottoman Empire, the majority of blacks that they have been residents in Palestine, they have been slaves. And slaves, we can find a slave in nomad regions, rural regions, and in urban regions. So, because of that, it can explain for us why there are black people that they are living in different, villages or different cities in Palestine. So, we have a community that they are living, they are considered as nomad in the Negev, which is in the desert of the Negev, and we have people that they are living in different villages. I can imagine now one of the example as Kofar Qasim as an example, and we have others that they live in the city. And I think this category also give us an indication about whom these people. So the people that they used to live in the nomad and the rural area, they were in the majority they were slaves, and in the cities they were the free or the free people that they are the the Muslim community that they are and the Christian community that they were living there. So this is a little bit about the history of the Africans that they are living in Palestine. So as yani, continuity for this history, I think yani, in general, yani, the Black Palestinians in Palestine, they have been, though you are classified as from non-Muslim, a Muslim, or a peaceful region, in general, the black that they are living in Palestine, they are named as Abid, because this is bring back the the stereotype, the Arabic stereotype towards the word Abid. Though during the history of enslavement in Palestine, there were white white slaves, but they haven't been considered in the same category as the black slaves. So we have also in the slaves we have different categories. So we have the slaves that they or different nomination or different names for the slaves. So it's not like in America we can't. And they were a little bit abid. It means a slave, but also we can use another references as atiq, as sorry, as riq, which means also a slave, and qin, which means the slave of the house. And there were a little bit categories between different slaves, and also the woman slave, they call them in different denomination. They call one of them, they call it which is in sexual relationship with her owner or her master, they call her Sariya, which is normally it had been a white slave, and the other they call them Jaria. Jaria, that means that she works in the house, or she do different kind of servitude. So servitude. So I think that the different also it have been cause it had been different because of the color of the skin. So we have what we call it the dark skin. There were a difference between the dark skin and the light skin. So in some of the resources we can find that they name the people that according to their color of the skin, they say black slave or red slave and white slave. So it's also a way in order to classify the slaves that we use in Palestine. For the Muslims that they arrived from from the Islamic region in Palestine and in Africa, they used to call them Takarni. But really, this is the name that it had been given for them. This is not the real name that that they used to be identified. For them, they are not the Karne. They are not from this region. They are from, ascendant of the tribes such as Fulata, Hausa, or other tribes. So we are talking about different perspective, the outside perspective, which is our outside nomination, which is have been given by the Arabs, especially for the geograph Arabs, because Ibn Battuta, the first, I think, the geograph, the famous geograph, he named that this area is called the Takrur area, and Ibn Khaldun also he named it in the same way. But for the African themselves, they named themselves according to their tribes. So this is a distinction also between the outside the nomination from outside and from inside. Most of the people, as I say, they came, the majority of the Black Africans, they have been deported as slaves. Because of that, we can find a small group that they are considered to be free, which are the African community that they are living in Jerusalem. The others, they have been, deported as slaves. So we have a forced migration for these people, and there were a distinction between the two groups. So we don't have, the same, we are not classified in the same thing. And most of the time, our ancestor or our first generation as Palestinian from from Black from Jerusalem, most of our first generation or our father, they used to tell us that we are not slaves, we are free men and free women, that we came to Palestine and for different reasons we came in order to participate in the Arab army in order to defend Palestine in the 48, and we had been part of the this army in order to stop the Zionist movement in Palestine. And after that, we had been settled down in Palestine, and they created their own group. So this is what we can consider it as the distinction. For the Black Africans, as I say, Black Palestinians that they are living in Palestine, they are living in different locations. So we have Blacks that they are living in, now they are living in cities, villages, refugee camps, and also in Negev, and as considered as a building. So we have a different categories of location where there are the groups of African, and I don't want to say communities because there is a big discussion about if we have communities or not, if we are a community or not. But really we have only we can consider groups that they are joined together and they are living in a separated neighborhoods in different locations. So in Jerusalem they are living in a small two ribats, and in Gaza they are living in a quarter which is called the quarter of the Summer there in Khan Yunis, and in other places it's the same issue. This is what I can say about the history of the African.
Thank you. Marc, is there anything you would like to add to that? You're muted, Nelson. Okay, yeah, you're good.
You hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Okay. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think Yasser covered the bulk of it. I mean, I think a couple quick things I would add, just in the interest of time as well. I think, first of all, just to give context, I am an ethnographer. I'm a cultural anthropologist who has spent the last 5 years studying these communities. So of course I defer to Yasser because that's home for him.
Yeah.
And so his insights are going to be more deeply entrenched than mine could ever be. So I want to begin with that premise that I'm an outsider, a very much an outsider to this. but I spent the bulk of my time in Jerusalem, in the African Quarter, where Yasser's family is from. And I've spent a great deal of time with his family and with many of the other families that live in this community. And so part of what I was thinking about when you asked the question about Black Palestinians, I think it's really important when we frame these conversations, language becomes very, very important for how we make sense of how people experience race in Palestine. And the first thing that we often do in the West is take our racial frameworks, our language, our words, and then bring them into Palestine or into Jordan or into Qatar or wherever, and say, okay, where are the Black Jordanians? Where are the Black, where are the Black Palestinians? And in doing so, we don't just use the language. We don't just import language, but we often also sneak in ideas and we take for granted certain understandings of how race operates. And so I would argue, I would begin by saying even the language of Black is very much rooted in Western ideas around the Black-white racial paradigm. The idea that there are, you know, the what it means to have Black in America refers to the way that people who look like us are racialized. It's an identity marker in terms of how we're racialized in America. There is a racialization process that happens in Palestine as well. But the primary way that people are racialized in Palestine is not by skin color. In other words, you know, Ruth Gilmore talks about racism as being the systems in place that subject you to premature death. The thing that makes you vulnerable in Palestine is not being from Chad or from Nigeria or from Senegal or from Sudan. The thing that makes you vulnerable to premature death, the thing that makes you unsafe and unprotected in the Palestinian context is being Palestinian. And so it's the racialization of the Palestinian that is the thing. So part of why I'm always skeptical of the language, the frame of Blackness, is because it makes people think sometimes, even as I'm working on a film on the entire kind of historic Palestine, and we begin to ask questions about what it means to be Black in the Holy Land. I'm doing that with irony, my language of Black in the Holy Land. The first thing people say is, oh, wow, so there's Palestinians and they're oppressed, and then the Black ones must be super oppressed. And there is anti-Blackness in Palestine. There is a way that Black people are, I mean, the area, which is where they're from, if I'm walking through the old city of Jerusalem and I say, you know, where's the African Quarter, the African community, people are much more likely to say Habs al-Abid, right? They're much more likely to say Habs al-Abid than Jalal al-Fiqhiyya or Hayy al-Fariqa or something like that. In other words, it's much more likely that they're going to use a racial slur, matter-of-factly, to frame and use that word Abid that Yasser talked about, right? And even the very idea that these people are of slave origin and what the social category of the slave means is itself a way of knocking Black Palestinians down a peg. So I'm not denying the anti-Blackness, but I think for me, when in my own work, what I try to do is, you know, when I talk to people in Jerusalem, they very much will say I'm using Afro. I'm Afro-Palestinian. I'm Afriqi Palestini, right? They're very clear about that. But when I go to Jericho, if I go to Ain Diuk, they're not going to say I'm Afro-Palestinian. I'm a Palestini, right? And if I ask where they're from, Ereha, I'm from Jericho. And if you say, well, yeah, but before that, they'll say Diuk. If I go to Tulkarm and say, where are you from, the refugee camp, they're going to say I'm from Tulkarm. And if I say, yeah, but before Tulkarm, they're going to say Wadi al-Hawadith. They understand that somewhere in the back is Africa, but their primary identity is not African. That's why it's Palestinian, and that's why Yasser's point is so important. So for me, what I like to say is, and this is the academic in me, you know, we always need to tweak language, but for me, I talk about Afro-Palestinians as being people who identify directly with their African origins and who can trace them. Yasser's point's an important one, right? The Afro-Palestinians, their narration story is that we came here in the last 100 years. We were pilgrims. We were in the Arab Liberation or Salvation Army. We were deeply invested in the resistance movements, right? In 48, prior to 48, and then even in 67, right? So much of the resistance narrative is look at what's her name? Yeah, Fatma Barnawi, right? Again, a Jerusalemite, right? Look at her resistance, right? We are citizens. We are Palestinians. We are dying for Palestine. We are resisting for Palestine. We're being incarcerated for Palestine. But Africa's in the backdrop, right? They still know their Selamat tribe. They still know their Fulani. They still know where they're from, right? Very much so, right? I mean, I'm sure Yasser's family, Chad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can say, Yasser, your family's from Chad. I can go his next door neighbor and say, okay, his father's from Chad, his mother's from Nigeria. I can say his one's Fulani, one's Selamat. Right? We can go all around. I can go to each house in his village and find out where they're from. But I can't do that in these other places, right? If I go to Rahat and say, where are you from, right? If I go to Rahat or if I go to Beersheba, right? They know they're from somewhere. They can see their own skin.
Yeah.
And they know that there was some Bedouin slave trade. But again, there's often the way that they narrate their experience and talk about their journey is very different. And so for them, instead of saying Afro-Palestinian, for them, because they don't self-identify as Afro-Palestinian, this isn't me attaching labels to them. It's me talking about how they talk about themselves. I call them Afro-descended Palestinian, African-descended Palestinian, or Afro-descended Palestinian, meaning Africa's in the backdrop. We can look at them and see that. But Africa being in the backdrop is not how they self-identify or how they self-narrate. So for me, those are the two distinctions. But I do think it's important, and just to say one last thing, which is to Yasser's point again, the group that Yasser's talking about, again, they come from 4 places: Senegal, Chad, Nigeria, and Sudan. They arrived here in the 20th century, largely. Many were religious pilgrims, and this is what he was getting. Many were religious pilgrims. There was a time where after you made Hajj, and this doesn't really happen as much as anymore, but there's a process of kind of purifying or taqdis at Hajj. I mean, like there's a way that you complete or consecrate. There's no exact English word for it, but there's kind of consecration or holification of the Hajj by going from Mecca and Medina to
the third holy place.
Third holy place. The third holiest place, right, which is Aqsa. So they would return there. Some would find love. They found love there. They got married there. They had children there. Some decided that they wanted to be defenders of the mosque, right? They wanted to be security, but particularly Senegalese men were often found to be powerful security forces. Again, what does that mean? We can talk about what that means, playing into stereotypes about the African body, about physicality, about violence. But they were asked to do that. And then the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Al-Hajj Amin Husseini, found an incredible affinity with these people, and not only wanted them to be defenders of the mosque, but wanted to create space for them. So the 2 Rabat that he's talking about, which are right in front of Bab al-Majlis, right in front of the Aqsa compound, which at one point they've been Mamluk prisons, they've been Ottoman. I mean, they've been a few different things, but you have two buildings at one time were prisons, right? The hanging prison and the blood prison. Now they're places where people live. They're given that land by Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, but it's paid by the Jordanian Waqf or the Jordanian trust, and it's a symbolic fee they pay. But they live there. So you have a community of Afro-Palestinians who live there, who are Palestinian, right? But they also have a very complicated relationship. And I know I'm probably cutting across some of these questions, but I think it connects. They have a very complicated relationship also to the community. They are Palestinian. There's no doubt about that. No one doubts their Palestinianness, right? But some of them also have very different relationships to the state. For example, there's a brother in the community. There are some people. I give you an example. One is from Chad. I'm thinking about Muhammad. Actually, no. Let me not use names. Forget Muhammad. That didn't happen. There's a whole other person who, couldn't get a Jordanian passport. Right? They couldn't get. They have an iqama. They have a like a permanent.
It's like me. It's like me, Mark.
Right. Exactly.
As an example.
So you're a perfect case. But one of the interesting is some people older than you, when they were there during Jordanian occupation, the Israelis said, you get a Jordanian passport. And the Jordanians gave people passports, but some of the Afro-Palestinians couldn't get the Jordanian passport. They said, because you're not Arab.
Yes.
You're not Palestinian. Now understand, there are people from Turkey, of Turkish origin. No one was questioning their Palestinianness because they've been there long enough. No one was questioning the people who were Lebanese. I mean, if you look at some of the historical records, there was a time prior to the kind of fortification of the nation state where people would travel from place to place. And you could even switch. I mean, the idea of the passport was far less rigid when the nation state was still a nascent idea. My point is, Afro-Palestinians, despite being Palestinian, they couldn't get the Jordanian passport. They said, go to Chad, right? In fact, Mahmoud Jeddi will tell you this story. So I can say
Mahmoud Jeddi,
Mahmoud Jeddi will tell you the story. He said, they told me to go to Jordan. And Jordan said, no, go to Chad. And Chad said, well, no, we're colonized. So go to the, and so he's traveling and nobody wanted them, right? Because there's a way that they were illegible as full citizens because of their blackness. Or because of their color, their blackness, right? So there's a very complicated dynamic here. So when I think about the origins, but nonetheless, these people came from these countries, they're here, they haven't gone anywhere, and they're not planning to go anywhere. Despite the fact that there's a push to get them out, not because they're black, but because they're Jerusalemites. And the commitment is to get all Palestinians out of East Jerusalem. Yeah.
And because they are Palestinian.
Exactly.
Of course.
Because they are Palestinian. Because they are Palestinian. But I want to just to add something, because we are talking about the history. Some of the people also, Mark, they came as refugees, because especially from Senegal, because during that period it was the colonization, it was the French colonization, and most of them, they have been participating with Othman bin Fodo, and there were a lot of groups that they have been going through all the region. It's not just only to Palestine, it's also to Mecca and other countries such as Cameroon and other places that they started in order to establish their own communities, a small community, religious communities, which is affiliated to one of the most important, one of the biggest, Sufi movements in Africa, which is called the Tijaniya. So we can find that in the African community also there is members. There were our uncle Muhammad al-Qadi, that he is originally from Nigeria, that he created the movement, he created the group of Tijaniya in Palestine. So we have this kind of link also, the religious link with Palestine, which is, for all the Muslims, it's the third place of Islam. And also, according to my father, and once my brother, he asked him a question, why you came to Palestine? So he told him that I wanted to be in the first line to meet God, because this is the place where the judgment place. This is the place of judgment. So my father, as a personal story, my father, he left his 3 sons in Chad, and he came and he established a new family in Palestine. So I think there were a huge motive for him in order to quit Chad, particularly Messina, which is his own village, in order to come to Mecca first, and after that to come to Palestine and participate and stay, and also decided in order to stay in Palestine. But also it wasn't only his own decision, because it was the changement of the occupation, because Palestine had been occupied in 48, colonized in 48, and occupied in 76. So we have 2 periods that the African Jerusalem, the status of Jerusalem, it had been under the Jordanese authority, and after the occupation, it had been turned to the Israeli authority. So we have all these stories, or as Mark says, for me, I'm a Palestinian. I don't have a Jordanian passport, because the status of Jerusalem, all the Palestinians that they are living in Jerusalem, they have the right in order to get a passport, a Jordanese passport, a temporary Jordanese passport. But in my case, it's so complicated. Because my father, from the perspective of the Jordanese, my father, he's a stranger. He's not an Arab. He have a French passport. So when he came to Palestine, he came with the French colonial passport, and this is the thing that we have. And during to the law, the Jordanese law, he's not allowed to be married with another Arab, with a Jordanese. So we don't have neither French passport or the colonial passport, neither the my mother passport, which is the Jordanese. So what we have it's only a travel document that it allow us to travel, and it's an Israeli travel document, and it's also you have to nobility, and we are considered as Jerusalem as residents, that we are not citizens of Israel. So this is the status also the legislative status of Jerusalem according to the Israelis.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I think it's really important for us to remember the different complexities within Palestinian identities, and especially Palestinian identities of those who have African descent. So that kind of points to my next question. I was curious if you guys could talk about the kind of roles that Palestinians of African origin have taken in the Palestinian struggle. Marc, you kind of mentioned this a bit before.
Yeah, I think that the roles that people of African descent have played in the Palestinian struggle are the roles Palestinians played in the Palestinian struggle. I think that if you walk up to anybody, and again, Yasser will tell you this even better than I could, but if you walk up to anybody in the African quarter in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and you ask them about their role, it's a very proud one, right? Part of how they assert their Palestinianness and aver their Palestinianness is by talking about their commitment to the resistance, right? If I go into a Palestinian home and nobody's been to jail, I got questioned. If I go to a Palestinian home and no one, particularly if you came up during the first Intifada, my question is, none of y'all got there's something unusual about that, right? And so Palestinians in that sense are no different. I think that they have played very prominent roles, though. So it's not just that they've played roles. Fatima Barnawi wasn't just arrested. Fatima Barnawi, first of all, was a key advisor and consultant to Yasser Arafat. Fatima Barnawi was the first woman arrested in the resistance movement after the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem in '67. The movie theater where the bomb went off is what a lot of people focus on. But there's a much bigger conversation about the way that Afro-Palestinians in general have played a role in this. And it's not just an outlier. It's not just her. And after she gets out of prison, remember, she gets out of prison, comes back and becomes the leader, the commander of the police force, of the women's police force. So they've played significant roles. When you look at the PFLP, under the leadership of George Habash, many of the prominent leaders of PFLP, even particularly if you look at in prison, much of the prison leadership of PFLP was Afro-Palestinian. But if you look at PFLP, if you look at any of the resistance movements, including the PLO, there's significant resistance there. And it's not just in Jerusalem. This is the last thing I'll say, because I know we got to move faster. Yeah. If you go to Jericho, I mean, I spent a great deal of time in Jericho with a brother. In fact, it's ironic, his name is Tikrori, right? And you probably know
Jamal Tikrori.
Jamal Musa, the whole the bee farm below. So, and when you go there, you see Isa is still incarcerated. He's doing 20 years for resistance. Musa was a driver for Yasser Arafat. So the entire family. So if you're the driver and you're in the police force and you're in the army and you're getting arrested, you are central. You're tied up in this. They're not outliers. They're not outliers to the resistance movement. They're right at the heart of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's definitely important to remember that, when any struggle, even if it's a something that could seem, I guess, a bit smaller, but obviously isn't something like getting arrested, it's all part of advancing the Palestinian cause. And obviously Palestinians of African descent are part of that as well.
Right.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you would like to add to that point?
I think, I want to I think Mark, he was pointing about the figure, one of the most feminist figure in the Palestinian struggle, Fatma Barnawi, that also she was the creator of the police woman in Palestine. So she was the creator of this police woman legions or something like this. And listen, for us, yani, as for me as Yasser, yani, to be a Palestinian it's a choice. I haven't been born. It's not just only I have been born in Palestine. It was a choice for me to be a Palestinian. So I think most of the people of the African community in Palestine, in Jerusalem, I think they have been chosen to be Palestinian from the beginning. Yeah, I think from the beginning of the Palestinian resistance. And it's not just only about the community from Jerusalem, also through history. When we are talking about one of the figures before our talk, Tariq al-Afriqi, he was originally from Nigeria. And Al-Hajj Mufti Husseini, Al-Hajj Amin Husseini, he asked him in order to lead and, to lead all the troops, the military troops that they have been in Gaza and in Gaza, especially in the Gaza. And he was one of the figures that he stopped the occupation of Jerusalem, of one of the villages of Jerusalem. It's called Jabal al-Mukabbir. So it was in the 13, I think, during 14 in the 14 during that period of the beginning of the colonization of Palestine. So it had been continued by the participation in the national movement. So we have a figure such as Fatma Barnawi, that she is from Nigeria, originally from Nigeria, but we have also Mark mentioned one of the figures, Mahmoud Jaddi. Mahmoud and Ali Jaddi, they served nearly 17 years in prison also, after the beginning of the occupation. And we have a lot of brothers and sisters that they have been serving different periods in prison and they have been participating in the resistance, in all the battles of the national of a national struggle. So when we are talking about the participation in Lebanon, they have been the Black Palestinian, they have been presenting there. There were one of the articles that it had been published by the Black Panthers with an interview with a Black from Haifa, that he was participating in the resistance in Lebanon. We have other brothers. The brother of Fatma Barnawi, he had been also part of that. We have martyrs in Lebanon. We have the first martyr in the second Intifada in 2000. His name is Osama Jaddi. So during all the history, we have been engaged, and it's not only the Black that they have been in Palestine, and we can talk about other Blacks that they have been also coming to Palestine and be participating in the resistance. I will talk about one of the story about one of the Sudanese. His name is Musa. And Musa, he was one of the members of the PFLP that they crossed the borders in order to make a military action in Palestine in the beginning of the first Intifada. Musa, he served nearly 13 years in prison, and now he is working in the Palestinian embassy in Sudan. He came from Sudan and he joined the resistance in Lebanon, and he had been trained there. And after that, he decided in order to come and to sacrifice his life to Palestine. We call them Fidaiyin. We call them Fidaiyin because they came in order to sacrifice their lives for Palestine. He had been captured, and he spent 13 years in jail. And after that, the Shalit exchange, he had been released, and he stayed a little bit in Gaza. And after that, he decided in order to go to Sudan. So we have a long history of engagement of Black. It's not just only the participation in solidarity. It's an act. I think it was much more an act, and to be active in the Palestinian, liberation.
Thank you. I just want to be
tiny thing, and I promise.
No, it's fine.
The other thing is that sometimes we think about resistance in these grand ways, joining military, some act of violence, some act of political commitment, which are all part of resistance. But the Afro-Palestinian community also, I think what we have to think about is the everyday acts of resistance that they engage in. Again, the Afro-Palestinian community in Jerusalem is positioned directly in front of Aqsa Mosque. So whenever there is an argument, whenever there's a settler march, whenever there is any kind of violence, they are the front line of it. Whenever there's an attack on Aqsa, and this goes back to you go back to the 1920s in terms of being security forces for the mosque. But when you live in the and when you're going to Aqsa, when you're going through the old city and you turn into the African Quarter to get to through Bab al-Majlis, that's where everybody lives. Mm-hmm. So if somebody sneaks through there and sets off a bomb or does harm to somebody, they're the most vulnerable as well. So imagine being the African community in the most contested piece of religious real estate, maybe in the world, in the most contested city, in the most contested side of the most contested city of the most contested region, maybe in the world. So Afro-Palestinians are the epicenter of all of this. And so on a day-to-day basis, you can't walk through the African Quarter and not be taunted. If you sit there for a day, you're going to be taunted by settlers. You're going to have things thrown at you. You're going to have security forces harass you for no reason. You get what I mean? When they're trying to put metal detectors in Aqsa, and then there's a resistance, the Afro-Palestinians are right there. So they're just day-to-day life is resistance, even if you're not trying to be all, anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really important to add, just how their existence, like all Palestinians, but their existence is resistance. So that kind of takes me to my next question, which kind of focuses on discrimination, of course, from Israel, but also somewhat from within the Palestinian institutions. And Yasser, you kind of pointed to this a little bit earlier when you're saying the terms that sometimes Palestinians use to describe Palestinians of Afro descent. So my question is, what does it mean to be a Palestinian of African descent in relation to the types of discrimination they face from other we could say non-Black Palestinians or Palestinians who are not of African descent, or Palestinian institutions, as well as the same time dealing with the oppression from the Israeli state and Israeli society, because not only, of course, the Israeli state is racist, but also the Israeli society, of course, is also strongly anti-Black. So kind of and I want to direct this question to Yasser since this is your experience. So I want to ask, what is this experience like? I mean, obviously it's hard to probably summarize but yeah, could you speak to that a bit?
I will tell you a little bit story about. I will start with the story. When I was young, I think when I was 14, I have been in prison, and during the investigation, the investigator asked me, "You are Black. Why you are participating in that? Why you are throwing stones?" So I replied, "I am a Palestinian." I think. In the Israeli society, you can say that there is an institution of discrimination that it has been built. So there is a institutional discrimination, which we can call it like this, which isn't different from the Palestinian side. It depends also in what period of history. So when I start talking, I was talking about the period of the Ottomans. So now it's not the same. We can't judge the same issue now. So, because of also the participation of and the engagement of the Palestinian Black Palestinian in the liberation. So, but as Marc he say, when you are going around in the old city and you are asking about the African Quarter or Algeria, there are some of the people that they will say, oh, Habs al-Abid. I think also in Jericho it's the same, which is the prison of the slaves. And in Jericho, when you say I want to go to Ain Duke, they will say Abid Duke, which means also the slaves of the Duke. So I think that there is a discrimination, but I think in the Palestinian society it's not. It's a racial. There is this kind of racial discrimination against the African, but also there is a question of class. So this is also there is a discrimination. Now, before 3 years or 4 years, I think in Ramallah, there were discrimination from the people of Ramallah against the people that they are coming, or the laborers that they are coming from the north. They call them that they are from, I forget the name. So they caricature, I mean, they name them in a way that they are discriminated. So if you are, if you are from the city, it's different that you are from the, from the refugee camp. If you are from this class, it's different from that other class. And inside the Palestinian society, we have this kind of categorization that is followed by your class, your class. And I think it's much more about the class, about who your background, where you are coming from, if you are a refugee or something like this, or something like that. But also, it doesn't mean that we don't have this kind of racial discrimination against the African or the black people. It doesn't mean like this. It doesn't mean. It means that they are, for them, for the Palestinian society, some of the Palestinian society, we are invisible. Sometimes we say that, oh, is there an African community? Is there black communities that they are living in Palestine? Yeah, we are not invisible. We are visible. Yeah, we are Palestinian. I think this is one of the side of discrimination against the black communities that they are invisible. That they are invisible in the the public scene, and when in the public the public sphere. So this is one of the kind that we can consider it as a type of discrimination, and also especially against the women. And I think that during the last 2 weeks, there were a video that it have been, watched a lot or something like this, about two couples, one from Madiha, she's from the Negev, and the other from Al-Fahim. And I was checked out, and I was shocked because they were talking about, wow, as if this is the first time that a black woman, she get married with a white Palestinian. It was, so for me, so stupid because as if it's a condemnation about racism in the Palestinian society. This is a condemnation about the thing that we are talking about. So this is one of the things that we have to, especially about in the gender, in the female, most of the time. In case of marriage, especially, the people, they will refuse to get people, black or white men, white families, they refuse to be married with a black girl because she is descendant of slaves or something like this, or because of she is of her color, that she is black. One of the issues of or you can say scale of integration, it's your color. If you are more lighter, you are more integrated. If you are more darkness, you are more discriminated. So this is a range that it's practiced in the Palestinian society. So people that they are much more lighter, they are much more integrated in the society because they are considered that they are similar to the white people. And that's why, and the black, much more the blacks, the dark skins, they are much more discriminated because this is one of the issues. Also, we can consider it as a circle or scandal of discrimination inside the society. Yes, Mark.
No, I was only going to say I agree, and I think that again, part of it is when we bring in these Western so I think that anti-Blackness exists, and I think you're right. And I think marriage is one of the places where you see it the most, because if you talk to my experience doing interviewing Afro-Palestinians is that I'll be like, is there racism here? No. The religious people will say, Islam ended racism. Some people will say the only racism we experienced is from the occupation. And then I say, but talk to me about marriage. And they go, oh, well, yeah, there was this girl I wanted to marry. Or, oh, yeah, I could. And the stories start to come out. And so I think that's absolutely true. And again, the anti-Blackness is there to the extent, as Yasser said, that the darker you are, the harder it is to integrate in society. But what I wanted to add also was, this idea of racism, right? Again, not from a Western place where we tend to reduce race to the black-white paradigm, and racism is rooted in a very specific kind of commitment against the primary expression of racism in America is anti-Blackness. I think we see Ansariya in multiple, right? So there's a way that Ansariya can be about race, but it can also be village to village. Yeah. It can also be region to region. And so it can be country to country. So if I were to say, you know, that and I even playfully to say like I'm racist against Jordanians, I would use Ansariya, right? Which isn't about skin color. So the reason I'm saying that is because, again, sometimes when we translate this conversation into English and we're having these kind of racial frames, we think of we overstate or understate what racism means in the Palestinian context. And I think it's really important to understand that the kind of Ansariya that we see is sometimes not about Yasser being black, although it absolutely could be, right? There's Blackness to be sure. But there's also that same Ansariya from somebody who's from Tulkarm and Mukhayyam, from the camp versus from the city, right? There's other, when we can think about the camp as its own kind of racialized identity in a certain kind of way to be a camp person, right? But I don't want to stretch it too far. But my point is that there's complexities of discrimination and racism that aren't as simple as, you know, black versus white. At the same time that there's anti-Blackness that plays out in terms of what people put on their skin, people's skin lighten, in terms of what kind of hair, in terms of the popular representation of the Palestinian in media. And it's not just here. I mean, if you go to Lebanon, you go to Jordan, right? You see these instances too. I mean, one of the most popular videos of the last 3 years is Gumi by what is her name? Fatis. She's a very popular Lebanese singer. It'll come to me in a minute. But in the middle of the video, she puts on blackface, and she's in the jungle, and she's dressed like an African, what we stereotypically assume as an African. So like it's a very complicated thing, and I just think we have to be. Maryam Fatis is her name, Maryam Fatis, and we have to think about all that stuff. I know we have to move to other stuff because yes.
Yeah, but let me add that the Ansariya, it's in the social and economical level. So we are talking about this is the level that we have it in comparison with the Israeli, which is more institutional. So for the colonization, it's much more institutional. So when we are talking about the statue of the Falasha, the Jewish that they are the black Jewish that they came from Ethiopia, where they are in the categories in the Israeli communities, and you can make a comparison with it with the Palestinian black African Palestinian or black Palestinian. So for them, the first accusation for us that we are Palestinian and plus we are black and plus if you are a female. So it's a triple discrimination if you are living in this context. So this is the thing that we are trying to explain.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's really important to kind of talk about the, I guess, intersection of the different experiences that Palestinians of African descent experience, and especially as you mentioned, Yasser, especially for women, how this factors in a bit differently for them. So for our next question, we only have about 5 minutes, but I wanted to ask how Black movements in the U.S. view the Palestinian struggle through the lens of anti-racism, and what have some of the consequences been of this mutual solidarity for both movements, both historically and currently, and why the solidarity is still relevant and important. So if we could start with Marc for this question.
I think that historically, so there's a few, I'll be quick, but this is a complicated question.
Yeah, I understand.
All right. Can I say one more thing about the last question?
Yeah, that's fine.
Only because it's very important.
It's okay, yeah.
The Ethiopian Jews, because we've only talked about Black, Afro-descendant sort of people, Palestinians, but there's also this question of the Ethiopian Jew, what we call Falasha, which we prefer to call Beta Israel, right? And you have, because this is a white supremacist state. And so so Palestinians are racialized, but on that racial hierarchy, Ethiopian Jews also are lower on the hierarchy. And so it's a very complicated dynamic language. When I first started doing field work in Palestine, the first thing I said is, you know, I would ask people in the African quarter, like, what do you think about the Ethiopian police officers? What do you think about the Ethiopian soldiers? Like, do you see Black solidarity? But again, they're not racialized this way. They're racialized Palestinian identity. So they were like, no, that's my occupier. And you have to also think about, so again, that's why the racial paradigm, the Black-white racial paradigm doesn't hold, because you see, again, an Ethiopian who comes, right? Most came Operation Moses or Operation Solomon. They were airlifted here decades after people from Yemen, decades after people, obviously decades after the, century after the first Aliyah, right? Decades after people from Eastern Europe and Western Europe, decades after American settlers. But they had to go to absorption centers, right? Some were sterilized. They were seen as outsiders, right? Juxtapose that to the Russians who came in the 80s, right? So there's a way that the Israeli racial project has room for Ethiopians for demographic reasons, but still frame them as lower on the hierarchy than an Ashkenazi, than a Sephardim, and what they call what we would call Arab Jews. They have them lower on the hierarchy, and so I think that's an important thing to think about as we talk about it, because sometimes, but that plays out in terms of anti-Black racism from Palestinians as well, because I've been at checkpoints where they'll curse out the Black Ethiopian, but they won't curse out the Russian. They'll use a racial slur against the Ethiopian soldier, but not against, so the Ethiopian soldier becomes Kushi, right? But the Russian does not. So we have to think about how anti-Blackness plays out in that context as well. And there's a lot more to be said about that, in terms of, we can talk about that. But the reason why that matters, partly because when Ethiopians were getting killed in the street a couple years ago, right? Some of them called me and say, well, can we join Black Lives Matter in the United States? So this creates a very complicated conundrum, because on the one hand, they're facing anti-Black state violence. Right? That their Blackness, their Ethiopianness is the thing that's making them subject to random or to less security, to premature death vis-a-vis the state. That's what they're arguing, right? And so if you're in South Tel Aviv and they're so they're calling us, but BLM is an anti-imperialist project, and we stand against the occupation. So how do we navigate that potential contradiction between saying, look, we don't want Ethiopian soldiers to be killed because they're Ethiopian. We don't want them to be killed, period. We want anybody to be killed, but we don't want them to be killed. We understand the anti-Blackness of this as well. But you're also occupying our Palestinian brothers who we stand in solidarity with. So we have to flesh out and work through those politics. Historically, and this is why I'm saying this, historically, and I'll be done in 42 seconds. Historically, initially, there was a strong movement of Black people supporting the Zionist project. The reason Black people support the Zionist project in America was because we weren't associating the Zionist project with dislocation, with settler colonialism, with the harm of Palestinian people. What Black people were attempting to do was imagine a political possibility that existed elsewhere, to say that we could have a national project that where we go to another place for safety, security, freedom, and self-determination. And so Marcus Garvey and even Elijah Muhammad, all these people saw what was happening from the end of the 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, and said, look, we like what's happening in Israel because we understand Zionism as a liberatory project. What we didn't understand at the time, what not enough people understood, was the dislocation that was happening, that this was a settler colonial project. And as you see, by the time you get to Charles Schuyler, when you get to the 50s, you begin to see much more Black people saying, wait a minute now. And then by the time you get to Malcolm X, right, when Malcolm makes his second trip, he makes his first trip in 59, his second trip in 64, Malcolm is, he's understanding this. He writes an essay, Zionist Logic. After the Nexa, after the war, the 67 war, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, writes a newsletter framing this as criticizing Israel, talking about this as as a colonial project. After the Bandung Conference, right, you began to see a shift in sensibility in terms of oppressed brown people coming together and saying, we have to fight colonialism. It became an anti-imperialist struggle. And so, yes, the first half of the 20th century, Black folk very much identified with oppression, but they saw anti-Semitism, they saw the pogroms, they saw the Holocaust, and they rightly said Jewish people deserve safety and security. But when we saw what the Israeli state began to look like, we understood something different. So Du Bois had a very problematic position, right, in 48. But by the time you get to 67, he's saying, wait a minute. I'm sorry, Du Bois died in 63. Let me not say that. By the time you get to 62, Du Bois is saying, wait a minute, this is looking different. And his vision was still a binational project where Palestinians wouldn't be removed from the land. Dr. King is often called a Zionist, but but by the time before King dies in 68, he didn't want to sign on to the basic letter. He didn't want to take photo ops in Nazareth or in Bethlehem on a holy trip, because he didn't want to be associated with what he saw was a growing problem, and really was a much more than growing problem, in the West Bank and inside of Israel. So it's a complicated story, but it was an anti-imperialist struggle. And that is why today we still have an anti-imperial, anti-colonial movement here, but we also have to frame this as an anti-racist struggle. One of the things we have not done sufficiently is frame the struggle for Palestinian freedom and liberation as an anti-racist struggle, because then we could see this as a global anti-racist struggle. And understand the racialization of the Palestinian and that being the thing, again, that subjects them to premature death.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that's a really great way to summarize how this issue not only deals with anti-imperialism, but also with anti-racism, and how, people in the U.S. have been able to take part of that struggle, or at least stand in solidarity with Palestinians. So yeah, again, thank you both so much for that. So before we move on to questions from our viewers, could you each recommend maybe a couple resources on the topics that we've discussed today, so people can look into that to further their knowledge on this topic, because obviously this topic is very broad.
Maybe what we could do in the interest of time is maybe is send out a book list. Oh
yeah, that would be perfect.
That'd be better. But on the topic of race in Palestine, Afro-Palestinian, not a lot written. Like Yasser and I have read every article. And it's a handful of articles, a few journalism. It's not a lot. I'm writing a book on this right now, partly for that, doing scholarship on this right now for that reason. But there's not a lot. But in terms of the broader picture, we'll sound.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Because we'll be emailing people afterwards anyway, so we can just add that to the list.
I would love to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So now we're going to open up the floor to some questions from our audience. So we would love to answer all of your questions, but due to the number of attendees and time, we might not be able to answer everything. So apologies in advance. Let me just pull this up to see some of the questions. So one question is from Zaha Hassan. And their question is, I find it very powerful to understand that being Palestinian is a choice for Afro-Palestinians. To what extent has Israel tried to co-opt the community, as has been tried with other Palestinian communities?
Have they tried to co-opt the community? That's a good question. Yasser, have you experienced that? Has the Israeli government attempted to divide or use the Afro-Palestinians against other Palestinian communities?
No, I don't know. But I will tell you a story that in the 18th, I think that the governor of Jerusalem, his name is Teddy Kolik, and he came to our community and he proposed in order to give us funds in order to continue our work in the community center or something like this. But our fathers, they refused, because they say that we can't cooperate with non-Muslims, because they are, for them, this is much more religious issue. But but for us, I don't think that there is this kind of separation, or no, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
I didn't think there was, but I didn't feel like I wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing. Obviously, he would experience it differently than I would.
Yeah, no, it's fine. We can go on to the next question. So the next question is from Tyrone Fleurizard. And the question is, what does Black solidarity look like? And how can Black Americans or other folks from the diaspora support the resistance?
I think for me, this question of solidarity is always a complicated question. What I like to talk about is what solidarity is not, and how maybe we shouldn't think about it. And I've written I wrote a short essay on Black Palestinian solidarity. It's in the Journal of Biography, which I'll add on the list as well. Because sometimes we try to, I think one thing we have to do is move away from solidarity as sameness. When I bring delegations to Palestine in the past, when I brought delegations to Palestine in the past, the first place I would go is the African Quarter. And they'd meet Mahmoud Jiddi, or they'd meet Ali Jiddi, or they'd meet Musa Takrori, or whomever, or not Musa Takrori, they meet Musa Qous, and they say, oh, look, there's Black people there too. Let's fight. And it's like, well, the solidarity that I want to form, to me, shouldn't hinge on there being people who look like you. But also we overplay sameness and we lose the nuance of what's happening. So the first thing to say is, well, there's Black people there. Well, yeah, but race works differently here. Or, oh, look, we have gentrification in the United States. That's the same thing as the kind of home demolition and removal that we see in Jerusalem. It's like, no, it's not the same, actually. The way that capitalism drives gentrification in the United States, and racism drives gentrification in urban America and say Brooklyn, is not what's happening in Jerusalem, where you don't have citizenship status, where you don't, where they're weighing your trash to see if you've lived in the house and to make sure you're following the Center of Life, Jerusalem Center of Life laws. It's a very different thing. I'm not comparing. I'm not having an oppression derby here. I'm saying that it's not always necessary to do that. The other question, solidarity, people talk about is showing up for each other, right? And I do think we need to do that. There's a way that we need to be in solidarity with each other, meaning that you need to be at our rallies. You need to be fighting for our causes. We need to be supporting each other financially. We need to be doing those things. But what I don't want to do is reduce solidarity to a transaction, because then that creates its own power dynamic, right? So there's a way that I can, even in BDS, right? Like, it's a power dynamic, right? It's easy for me for me to boycott in the United States. I can say, you know what? I'm not buying Intel chips. I'm not drinking this water. I'm not eating this hummus, which you shouldn't eat anyway because it's shit, sabra. But how can I tell someone I remember being in Lid one day, and I was I was like, wait, I thought we were boycotting this water. And he's like, what? I gotta go 10 kilometers to get another bottle of water. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it's like we have to understand that showing up for one another doesn't mean I do this for you and you do this for me, because we're not all, we don't have the same power dynamics. So I know I haven't said what solidarity is. I said what it isn't. But I think we have to find ways to support each other, to advance each other's political projects, and to see ourselves as part of a collective struggle. That's what solidarity means for me. But we have to make sure that it's on the proper terms.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to point out, because a lot of times I think people do kind of view solidarity as in like trying to find who's most similar to them around the world and standing up with them. But it shouldn't be like that. Right. Yasser, do you have anything to add to that question?
I think conscience and knowledge about the others, and this is the key. I think this is the key that we can. After that, you can decide what are your positions, and we don't have to tell the people what are their position and what they are engagement, but they have to know. I think that the most important thing is to know that. And if you ask me about when Marc was saying about Black, as a community, we are isolated. On all our life, we have been isolated. We don't know. We are not linked with our African roots. Yeah. And I think this is one when we are hosting a group from Africa, it's a celebration for us. It's an Eid, as we say it. This is a way that we bring back our knowledge. We rebuild our bridges with our roots. This is the thing that we are. And I think this is much more important for us. In order to. I think the first step in order to create and solve the bridge between all the solidarity, all the people that are fighting for the same cases in the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. So our last question is from Nadine Aranki, and the question is: can the speakers talk about the difference between racism in Palestine and the rest of the Arab world for people of African descent? And Yasser, if you want to start with that one.
It's for me it depends. It depends. If you are talking about the example of Kuwait, they are considered that they are unknown. unknown, that they have no rights, they are not considered as a human, they are not considered as anything. In Yemen also they are different, they have a different nation, they are called Harratin, they are called Khallasi. In North Africa they are called in different nominations. So I can't reply, and we don't know really. And this is one of the problems, one of the biggest problems that we are facing, that we don't know about our history. We don't know about what is happening in these, Arab countries, and what are the obstacles that the Black Africans that they are facing in their daily life. Because of that, we are trying to, as now as activists or from the Arab world, and also academic from the Arab world, we are trying to create a resource center in order to give information about the different situation of the Black in the Arab world. And this is the aim, in order to enlighten the things, in order to just share the information about other of the world. Because one of the problems that we are facing in order to rewrite the history of the Africans, that most of the history, that's an oral history. We don't have sources, we don't have access to sources in order to rewrite the historiography of the African communities. And we are facing the same, this problem. And also the most important thing, that all the articles that have been written of the Africa, and it have been written outside, from outside perspective, not from our inside perspective. And this is the moment that the Black Africans, that they have to create, to rewrite their own history from their own perspective. And this is the moment, I think this is the moment that we are trying to use it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always important for people definitely to write their own stories and their own histories. Marc, would you like to add anything to this question?
I think he hit the nail on the head. I think that, again, this idea of racism, again, these I'm always unpacking words. So the idea of racism. There's also this question of tamyiz, right? This idea of discrimination.
Yeah.
And making these distinctions. So, for example, he mentioned Kuwait, the population we'd call Baduns, right?
Yeah.
The idea of being without a Baduns, it's a question of origin, but it's also a question of citizenship. And so part of what we have to think about is the way that systems are established that are bound up not just in skin color, but in caste, in class, in slavery history, etc. And I think when we see in Palestine, even the resistance or the reluctance for people who are of a history. I mean, I can't tell. I've never met an Afro-Palestinian who says, "Yeah, we were slaves." Right? Everybody left Mehmet Ali Pasha's army. Everybody was in the Uthmani army. Everybody was a pilgrim. Nobody ever says, "Yo, yeah, I was a slave." And so, and the reason I'm saying that is because there's a social identity bound up in that, right? And so, in some ways, that is as significant a part of our identity as this other stuff. And when you travel around the world, the Arab world in particular, whether it's in Libya, right? There's the question of skin color always. That we live in a white supremacist world. But it's also a question of citizenship status. It's also a question of how your labor is being exploited. When you go to Dubai and you look at the average, or Qatar, right? If you're sitting in Doha and you look at you can go from the airport in Doha. I spent a week in Doha and didn't meet anyone who spoke Arabic. Right? Like everybody was from the Philippines. They were from a few people from Egypt. A few people from West Africa, but nobody was Qatari, right? And it's a fascinating thing, but none of them were citizens. And so when you say, well, the average household income in Qatar is this, that's because all these people aren't the average Qatari. Yeah. Right? So the reason I'm saying that is because they have their own status of exploitation, and there is a systematic denial of access to social goods, right? Which is how we sort of frame racism here, right? But it's not because of their skin color. There are people in Jordan, what we call the Ghor or the Ghorwani, right? In the Ghor, the Ghorwani, who look like Yasser, right? Who have plenty of access to social goods. I can be in Amman and see people and walk in the store and they look just like you, Pascal, or me. And it's not that's not the primary thing that gets them that. But there are people who are as white as your whitest white man, but they left during the Nexa in '67, who will never have permanent Jordanian status, and while they are not marginalized in the way that they could be in other places, they will never have full citizenship because of their Palestinian identity, right? Yeah. So it's complicated, you know, and so the way racism plays out, Sudan. I mean, anyway, I don't want to go on and on, but if you look in Sudan, if you look, I mean, everywhere we go, there's racism, and it's not just it's everywhere, and we have to hold tight to that too.
Yeah, that's it's a very important thing to remember. Unfortunately, that it is just a white supremacist world, but also that, you know, there's different like complexities within every society, like based on different things, and it's not always just down to someone's skin color. So I think we have time for one more question. This question is from Manishta Sunia. And the question is, they said, I was wondering if the speakers could expand on gendered anti-Blackness with regards to the personal and cultural, such as kinships, but also with regards to gendered labor in resistance work, also perhaps sexuality/queerness.
Can I go first only because I have to leave?
I
have another event in 3 minutes.
That's fine.
First of all, we can't talk about race without looking at the intersection of gender and sexual identity in lots of ways. So the first thing I'd say is part of how the Israeli state has operated with regard to these issues is to position itself through the Orientalist lens as the kind of alternative to Arab barbarism, right? We're racially progressive, right? We're gender progressive. We're sexually progressive. So the practice of pink washing, the practice of even greenwashing, right, in terms of environmental abuse, these practices are used to divide folk. That's not to say that there aren't significant concerns and critiques we need to have within Palestine around sexual identity. I mean, if you look at what happened with Qous, the organization, and the type of resistance and violent resistance that they experienced at the hands of the Sultan, at the hands of the PA, we could just see one. This is one of many examples of how queer identity is absolutely not welcomed within these spaces. We have to be honest about that, right? We have to be honest about the way that happens. We also have to be honest about how much of anyway, that's a whole other conversation we could have about some of these organizations, like Aswat and other organizations in Israel that tend to focus on white women and their needs, not the needs of queer men, trans folk, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is part of the conversation we need to have. In terms of the gender piece in terms of gendered labor, one of the things we have to look at is that the way that gendered labor happens, not just along racial lines. If you walk through Jerusalem, there'll be women selling all sorts of wares, all sorts of food, all sorts of vegetables. And the reason why they're doing that is because oftentimes these are women, first of all, after a certain age. So part of it is being able to pass through the security checkpoints after a certain age more freely. Part of it is that men aren't being allowed through. So these women are often early in the morning going through villages, going through bushes, circumventing the checkpoints to go there to sell stuff to bring back to their homes and villages. And because they have Hawiyah, but they don't have Iqama, they don't have the permit, the Jerusalem permit. If they get hit with a fine, the fine could be 500 shekels. And so if you get hit with a 500 shekel fine when you only made 400 shekels that month, you're jacked up. But my point is, so much of the household income comes through the gendered labor of Palestinian women. So you see, at least in Jerusalem, I can't speak as much. I haven't, and I got to be honest, this isn't my primary area of studies, but I can tell you that the gendered labor of women in Jerusalem, and Louis, we can talk about Aswat, but I can tell you, let me be more clear about Aswat. What I say is many queer Palestinians have expressed that concern about Aswat. That's not my critique of Aswat. I've worked with Aswat, I've organized with Aswat, but many Palestinians have expressed concern about Aswat in terms of them focusing more on issues of queer identity that exclude trans folk and exclude some other issues that are happening. Again, I think it's more complicated than that as well, Louis, but I needed to be clear about that, and thank you for that corrective. So, but yeah, in terms of gendered labor, that's what I would say. But I think there's not enough conversation about the particular ways that both racism and discrimination operate against women. So, for example, if we look at in terms of body image, in terms of representations, right? In both in the African Quarter and in other places that I've seen, again, the promotion, the anti-Black promotion leads to skin bleaching. It can lead to other unhealthy, physically unhealthy choices. If you look at, if you, again, I don't want to reduce gender issues to issues like marriage and beauty, but these are the issues that have been expressed to me by the people I study. Is they say that oftentimes Afro-Palestinian men will marry, white-looking Palestinian women, but that it's much harder for them to get the opposite to happen, and so they're often left with fewer marriageable options, and as a result, it shifts how they operate. Right, being able to operate in the public sphere in the 21st century becomes much more complicated, particularly in Jerusalem. They say in Ramallah or Al-Beira they have much more freedom, but in Jerusalem it's much more difficult, and some of that is around various levels of religiosity. Anyway, I have to go. I apologize that I have an event that I'm now late for.
That's fine. Thank you.
But I want to thank all of you. I want to thank McCann. I want to thank you for organizing this. I want to thank everybody who has made this happen, and of course Yasser. This is my first time meeting Yasser, so it's virtual. But I'm going to make a point to meet you in France so that we can sit down and have some coffee and really talk and learn from each other. But it's a pleasure to sit with you, my brother, as well, and learn from you. And to all the 379 people out there, thank you for spending some time with us and hanging out with us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You are totally welcome to France.
Thank you both so much. So we've reached the end of our talk for today. So thank you so much again to our speakers for giving their time and their fascinating insights. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for your time and engagement and questions. And if you've enjoyed today's talk, there's a number of ways you can support us. So if you can see at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a donate section. You can, for those of you who are able to make contribution, you can donate there, and you can also share our activities with your communities and join us at upcoming events. We've also now added all of you to our mailing list if you aren't already on it, so you'll be receiving updates on upcoming events and talks that we're hosting. We'll be holding another talk in the next month with the details to be released soon, so you should be able to see that. Please follow us on social media. At Instagram, it's at McCann Writes, and we're also on Twitter and Facebook at McCann Writes. And finally, just a reminder that we record all of our virtual talks with English subtitles, so you'll be receiving recordings of today's talk in the next few days. And thanks again for joining us, and I hope to see some of you at our upcoming events. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much.